Hi, coming up next on wood carving, we'll be making this old-style Puffin Decoy. So stick around.
Hello, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. Today we're going to be working on a reproduction of an antique Puffin Decoy, and this is the project we'll be doing. The unusual thing about this is it wasn't used by hunters, it was used by ornithologists to attract puffins to a nesting colony, but we'll talk more about that later. What I did was I made a pattern from the carving and then transferred that over to a piece of 2-inch white pine, which I'm cutting out right now. I'm using a bandsaw, and this is has a very large continuous circular saw blade fastened on a pulley on top and on the bottom, and the whole thing is driven by an electric motor. Let me just finish up here. There. That saves a lot of work hacking it out with a hatchet or something. To carve it, I just fasten it in my bench and get a large gouge. Oh, I think a 25 millimeter number 5 would work. And just start rounding off the corners. Now these gouges are made in a variety of different sweeps, and basically it's a metal blade fastened into a handle, and it's got a curved cutting edge. And that's called the sweep number, and they come in a variety of different sizes. Use a mallet. This particular piece of wood is a little resinous, and sometimes when it's hard you can use a mallet to help drive the tool through the wood. This mallet I'm using is one that's made out of lignum vitae, and it's a tropical hardwood, very dense with an interlocking fiber, so it's very strong and won't split. It works great. Probably want to work with a mallet that's maybe about 20 ounces in weight. You don't want something so heavy that it makes your arm tired, and you don't want something that's so light that you have to swing real hard to work it. We're making this decoy in kind of a traditional sense that we're using the hand tools to do the powering on the carving. Traditionally, a lot of the old decoys in the 1800s were made by power machines as they got more and more into production. But there's a wood carver over in Massachusetts by the name of Will Kirkpatrick that is still doing this by hand. Let's go take a look. We're here in Hudson, Massachusetts. This is Will's workshop. Let's go see what he's doing. Hi, Will. What are you working on today?
Hi, Rick. Well, today I have a batch of mallard hens here that I made up a few years ago. I made up the design a few years ago, but they're made right from old duck decoys that I used to use on a local river. And this is a typical old-timer's paint job, so to speak. You can see that I'm blending these colors wet into wet right at the very beginning here. That's one side. I generally do one side at a time so that the paint stays fresh and wet for the blending. I kind of rediscovered an old decoy making process, the technique of using the shaving horse and spoke shaves and draw knives. Very simple old tools that were very common in the old days. Shaving horses were common in every barnyard around here when I was growing up. Using the shaving horse as a key to speed in making great bunches of decoys. Also, the draw knife, which you would normally consider to be a very rough tool for rough hewing, actually can be used when properly sharpened with bevels and so on. Can be used in a very it can be a finesse tool, so to speak. It's a very, you can do a lot of very fine work with a draw knife. After the rough cuts are made with a draw knife, what I call the rough cuts, then a spoke shave is used to round the bird up and smooth it up. After that, of course, the painting process begins. There are many different ways of painting old decoys. Probably the paint jobs that I love the best were the jobs that were done on the early shorebirds. I enjoy making something of beauty. I consider it an art form, although there is some controversy about whether decoy making is an art or a craft. I believe that all decoys are part of an artist's effort, but there's no question that when the man made the first one, that was art.
One of the things I really like doing about the rustic decoys is you don't have to have a lot of precision. You can just take your time and have fun removing the wood. And that's the nice thing about decoys, because the birds weren't all that particular about how many feathers are showed or anything. They just had to be good enough just to fool the bird. So these are great projects because you can just work along and remove the wood and have a great time at it. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful of when you're carving is this thing called carving with a grain. And notice here, that as I work my tool, it's starting to dig in and splinter a little bit. Whenever you feel that happen, what you have to do is just turn your tool around and carve from the opposite direction. And that's because wood is made up of thousands of hollow microscopic fibers that give the wood its strength. But it also determines the direction that you can carve with a tool. Again, see it's starting to dig in there? If I were just to keep pushing, that's going to split off a big piece of it. So we just come around and work from the opposite direction. A bench is a must for having a project like this because you really need it fastened down so that you can keep both hands on the tool. Now, puffins are kind of an unusual bird. Sometimes they're called a sea parrot. And they're grouped with some other birds into a family Alcides. And they fill the same ecological niche that penguins fill in the Antarctica. The penguins sort of evolved to be the fish-eating birds of the southern hemisphere. And puffins and their relatives are the fish-eating birds in the northern hemisphere. And they nest in colonies, sometimes up as many as 50,000. And people in the islands, the North Atlantic, use them and their eggs for food, as do the seagulls. So they do have a fair number of natural enemies they have to be careful with. As I understand it, the colonies were getting kind of decimated, And biologists are trying to think of how to attract more birds into the nesting sites, because they tend to nest on rocky crags and barren seacoasts, and they're burrowers. They'll dig a burrow into the ground or find a cave in the rocks that goes back several feet. Well, biologists finally decided that they'd make decoys for the puffins, and that would attract them back. And I guess it worked, because the colonies are becoming reestablished in areas where they were becoming very scarce. I think I'm going to get my mallet for that. And when we talked about working with the grain and causing the wood to split, sometimes you can use that to your advantage. For example, here with a beak, if I'm careful, I can make a few taps and split some of that wood off. You don't want to get greedy and try to take too much off, or you may be looking for a new beak. Puffins have a very large, broad beak that has different colors on it. And it's how you tell the common puffins from the horned puffins and other varieties of seabirds. The common puffin has several different colored stripes. The mallet is great for getting through some of this tough wood. And remember, when you're using a mallet, you don't want to be pounding on it like a hammer. Just light taps. Use your wrist to let it do the action. And speaking of hammers, you don't want to use a metal hammer on your nice carving gouges, because the metal doesn't have any give, and it'll cause the handles to crack and fray and mushroom over. I think the rest of this we can just do by paring away the wood. One of the things that puzzled biologists for many years about puffins was the fact that they could take and hold a whole bunch of fish in their beaks, sometimes up toward of a dozen, and they just lay across their beak crosswise as they went out fishing for more. And they could never figure that out. And then they finally decided that the puffin must hold those in place with its tongue while it goes fishing for the others. I can't imagine how you do that. Sounds like a tough way to fish. But they're a very comical bird, and that's why they have sort of a warm place in people's hearts. Let's see, we can position this again here. We'll round off the top of his head. One little trick for doing the top of a curved surface like this is that you can invert the gouge and let that curved surface kind of work to your advantage. All right, it's coming along pretty good there. Now for getting the sides, what we can do is we can use our bench a little differently. By opening this up, I can put another piece of, in this case I'm going to use wood, to hold it in place. These are called bench dogs. And I always wondered why they were called bench dogs. Then I got a note from someone who said that they got the name because the Old English word was dag, which was D-A-G. And it comes from a very old pronunciation of dogwood, which means steak, because they use the dogwood tree for making a lot of steaks. So they call them dags because it was a steak, and then it became modified to dogs. So now they're called bench dogs. And while I've got them here, I'm going to take a minute and use a V tool. And this is a tool that's basically built like two chisels that come together to form an angle. And this is great for cutting incised lines. And we can take and just with one cut incise a line where the tail feathers would be. And we'll carry that on around the back there. Tip them over and we'll get the other side here. Now I use the metal bench dog on this side because I'm carving the other way towards the wooden one. And I made this little wooden one out of a scrap piece of wood, so when my tool comes close and hits it, it's not like hitting metal. You don't want to hit a piece of metal with your nice carving gouge. A nail or a screw or any kind of metal will nick the cutting edge. And that's kind of embarrassing. The tool doesn't cut very well, and you have to resharpen it. And we'll talk more about that one later. I think the best look I ever had at Puffin's was down in at SeaWorld in Orlando. And they have a great penguin and puffin display of live ones. And they're really neat birds. They look very happy and they're having a lot of fun. But what's interesting about them is they have webbed feet, like any of the other seabirds. And they're pretty clumsy when they're up on land. But they had a display area where you could stand below the water level and watch them. And they would use their webbed feet for swimming on the surface like a duck. But as soon as they went underwater, well, it was a whole different story. These guys, they swam faster than fish. And they do that by using their wings. Their feet were just kind of trailing alongside. And they'd be flapping their wings, really looking just like they were flying underwater. And it was so neat. They get going so fast they just fly right out of the water. Incredible. Really neat little birds. Okay, there we go. We like to make sure that's secured solidly so you don't go to carve it and then have it go boing and shoot off across the bench. That's always a nuisance. Now, because I'm going to be antiquing this, I'm not going to put a whole lot of detail on it beyond what we have here. Just enough to kind of give us our general shapes. And that's what's nice about a decoy. You don't want to spend a whole lot of hours on a working decoy because they're going to get beat up and battered out in the elements. I do have a little spot under his chin I'm going to clean out, though. And I think to do that, I'm going to use a gouge with a much broader sweep. This is in case it's a number 9, which has a more U-shaped sweep. And the bigger the sweep number, the more curve. And that's just right for getting underneath here. That curve just fits in there real good. Now, to antique this, there's a couple ways we can do it. What I like to do is, the way the wood is made up with the annual rings of the hard and soft parts, when they're out sitting in the weather, what happens is the elements and the sunlight causes the soft parts of the wood to wear away. We can cheat a little bit by using a propane torch and a wire brush. Maybe I should take a minute and clear the chips off here. So this is best to do outdoors, but you know, it's kind of yucky out there today, and I think we'll just give it a go right here. Now what the heat does is when we're doing this, it causes the annual rings to harden, and then it chars away the softer spring wood. And that's caused by when the tree grows, it's dormant through the winters. And then shazam, when spring comes, you've got this real nice warmer growing season. You've got a lot more moisture. And what happens, the tree grows real fast then, and the wood is more porous. As summer comes on, the wood slows down in its growing, and the cells become more dense and compacted. And that's why you get the hard and the soft wood in the annual rings of any particular given tree. It's more pronounced in some trees than others. For example, trees like Douglas fir and the yellow pine have a very pronounced difference. Some of the woods like basswood, you can't even see it. Now, to do the weathering, we can take a wire brush, and this is like something you'd buy to clean your garage or clean the old paint off your house, and just take and lightly brush away that charred wood. And what this does, it brushes away the softer areas and leaves the harder rings. And essentially what you're doing is recreating, a couple of decades of and the leaf and this shapes on the when we paint the stripes in. For painting it, I'm going to use acrylic paint, and this is a water-based paint, and it soaks into the wood nicely and gives you a very interesting effect. Traditionally, decoy makers weren't too fancy about their paint. They would use whatever they had around. House paint, boat paint. After the white paint is dry, then we can put on the black. And I'm using ivory black, and again I'm using the acrylics because it covers so well. The thing I've found, when you scorch the wood like this, it tends to soak up a lot of paint. So I like to put it on fairly liberally. You can use photo references as guides for how the color goes on, but don't get real hung up on making it exactly perfect, because these type of decoys were, as I say, they're just tend to be stylized, and they're more of a work of art than a piece of natural history authenticity. When all the paint is finally dry, what you can do is move on to the final step of the antiquing. And to do this, I'm taking a piece of fine sandpaper, 220 grit garnet paper, and just very, very lightly sanding over the areas where we painted. And see what happens? Those lines from the texture that we scorched in there start showing through the paint and improving this antique look. And just sand the whole carving very lightly like that to bring out the different grain lines. And that gives it a real nice weathered effect. For the eyes, what I've used is a hammer and a brass tack. And just take that, place it in the right position, and just tap that into place. I painted the outside of the eye red to match that on a puffin earlier, and then after it's nailed in, just put the black spot for the pupil of the eye. I waited until after I had done all the sanding before I painted the red and yellow ochre stripes on the beak, because that way you don't have to worry about sanding them all off when you're done. And then just drill a hole in the bottom of the puffin, mount them on a stick that's drilled into the base of a piece of driftwood, and there's your Puffin Decoy. Isn't that neat? Hey, next week we're going to be doing something a little more complicated. We're going to be doing a reproduction of an eagle from the period of the War of 1812. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks for dropping by. Until next time, I'm Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
Rick Butz has written 2 books entitled Wood Carving Step by Step, Woodland Creatures and Santas. Rick demonstrates and describes through extensive illustrations and photographs how to carve a chipmunk, a river otter, a red fox, an alpine St. Nicholas, an Adirondack Santa and his bear, and a Swiss St. Nicholas. The 2-book collection is available by calling 1-800-950-9648. The price is $29.90 plus shipping and handling.